Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. Thanks for joining us today. On behalf of INSA, welcome to this discussion on cyber threats to critical infrastructure, and thanks for your interest in this topic. I think just looking out at the room and the number of people that have showed up, I think we have a topic that is obviously timely and of great interest, so thanks for coming today. As INSA tries to make sure that we're have dragged ourselves into the 21st century. We're trying to do the right things in terms of generating interest on social media and so forth, not fake news, any of that sort of stuff. But if you have some things that you would like to share with your network while you're here, we're using the handle of #cyberthreats. So tweet away if you are so inclined. And I'm sure Sam's going to say such insightful things here that you'll want to tweet away, right? Okay, so INSA. Hopefully most of you know what INSA is. A few of you probably, this may be your first INSA thing, but our mission is to promote collaboration between the public and private sectors on issues related to intelligence and national security. So the intersection of cybersecurity and the functioning of the nation's critical infrastructure is one that INSA and its members felt deserved an in-depth discussion. This event is organized jointly by INSA's Cyber Council, which examines all manner of cybersecurity issues, and INSA's Domestic Security Council, which addresses homeland security challenges. The issues raised in this discussion will feed into a tabletop exercise that we will hold in November, I think November 8th. The exercise will examine in greater depth the challenges of ensuring public-private collaboration during a cyber attack on our nation's infrastructure. We'll compile the findings from today's discussion and the tabletop exercise into a white paper that recommends ways to enhance government and industry responses to a cyber attack. So before we get started, I think you'd all agree we have a very nice facility here that we have convened in, and that is thanks to thanks to MITRE. God, rhymes with cyber, right? But thanks to MITRE for hosting today's discussion. In particular, I want to thank Mark Rosenthal. Mark, thank you. Mark is the vice chair of our Domestic Security Council. And made this facility available to us, and also Don Scalisi from Thomson Reuters, who is the chair of our Domestic Security Council. I'd also like to thank ICF International, which will provide a facility for the tabletop exercise in November. ICF Sam Visner, the moderator of today's panel and a member of INSA Cyber Council, has been involved in planning both today's event and the November exercise, so thank you, Sam, as well. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors who made today's event and the November tabletop possible. Raytheon is today's breakfast sponsor. Thanks, Raytheon. ICF International and Spadaro and Associates are supporting sponsors, and we genuinely appreciate your support. And finally, Vencor is the premier sponsor for today's event and for the subsequent exercise. Vencor is an active corporate member of INSA and a thought leader in cybersecurity and homeland security. Its support for these events will make it possible to examine these critical issues. And just goes without saying, anytime we do these sorts of things, the folks that will step up and sponsor are the folks that make possible having these critical sorts of discussions. So thanks to all of our sponsors. So with that, I'm going to introduce Barry Barlow from Vencor, who's going to introduce our speakers and set the stage for the discussion. So Barry, over to you.
Thanks, Chuck. Well, good morning. I'm Barry Barlow. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Vencor, and we are proud to have the opportunity to sponsor the panel on the cyber threats to critical infrastructure. The possibility of a cyber attack that takes down critical infrastructure, it's not science fiction anymore. You can go back over the past 2 years and you can look, there's multiple adversaries in the United States that have the ability to attack our infrastructure. If you go back into 2015 and 2016, you can see the cyber attack that occurred in the Ukraine. More recently, You can also look at the attacks that Iran and North Korea have invoked on that. We've even had cyber attacks in the United States on our infrastructure in the state of New York. And you know, in the quadrennial energy review, the Energy Department, and we're fortunate we have a panelist from the Energy Department today. They asserted earlier that an attack on the power grid of just a large city could cause significant health, safety, security, and economic damage that affects millions of Americans. And you can turn on the news and see what the effect, the cost may be different, but if you look at the effect in Puerto Rico right now, you know, we're less than single-digit percentage people have power. What that's done to their nation and to the Americans that are living there. VNCOR is very interested in this. We do a lot of cyber research. The security grid is something we're very interested in. There's roughly 70 million smart meters in the United States. And the percentage of those that are monitored on a daily basis for cyber threats is also in the single-digit percentages. And so it is a topic that's interesting. We've got a great group of panelists here this morning, and our panelists bring expertise in the areas of Homeland Security, cybersecurity, energy, and transportation. And they work at both the federal, state level, and at industry. With that, I would like to introduce them. We have Devin Strait, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Security and Energy Restoration at the Department of Energy. We were scheduled to have the Virginia Secretary of Homeland Security, Brian Moran, here. He was called away on other business. But in his stead, we're going to hear from Isaac Janak, the Cybersecurity Program Manager of the Office of the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Going across the river, we have Cal Bowman, Deputy Director of the Maryland Governor's Office of Homeland Security. We also have William Anderson, the Senior Program Officer of the Transportation Research Board at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And as Chuck mentioned, our moderator, Sam Visner, the Senior Vice President, Cybersecurity and Resilience at ICF International, and certainly someone who's been leading in this area. This group is going to discuss, among other things, the roles and responsibilities of government and industry during a cyber event that affects critical infrastructure sectors, the means by which threat information is shared between public and private sectors, as well as between infrastructure sectors, and then lastly, how government and industry can work together to make American critical infrastructure more resilient against future attacks. And with that, I'd like to thank Chuck and our colleagues at INSA for their work to put this event together, particularly the INSA staff and the members of the INSA Domestic Security Council and Cyber Council. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the moderator, Sam Visner, to begin the discussion.
Thank you. And thanks for those kind remarks. And I want to thank our friends at VNCOR for stepping up and demonstrating their leadership in this field. And I also want to thank all of you for coming today and paying attention and contributing to this discussion. And most of all, I want to thank our panelists. The problem with getting a moderator is that although the moderator is supposed to facilitate the discussion, sometimes you get a moderator who has a point of view. And I know this is going to come as a shock to any number of you, but I do have a point of view. So to sort of set the stage, I'm going to share with you a little bit about how I think about the problem. And then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make some introductory comments, after which I'll pose some questions, and we've left some time, hopefully, for Q&A, unless, of course, you're a restive audience, in which case we'll try to deny you that opportunity. I do want to remind people that we have some friends here today from the media, so everything that is said is on the record. And I think that's true as well through social media. So, and I think that's all to the good, because the conversation that we're trying to have is one that should be had essentially in public and with the public. And that is my way of sneaking up on my own perspective here, which I'll use to sort of shine a light or maybe cast a shadow over the discussion. And that is, I've been thinking about the problem of cyberspace and critical infrastructure. And to me, there are some truths that have become inescapable. And that is, first, there is no possibility of disconnecting our critical infrastructure or any other infrastructure from the IT infrastructures on which they depend. I remember debates with people I knew on various advisory boards, including a friend of mine who said it was the worst thing in the world to even anticipate the idea of hooking up parts of the power grid to the public information infrastructure. Well, that's an interesting idea, but it's not meaningful anymore. That's happened. That's not something we have to worry about doing. We have to figure out the ramifications of something we've already done. That is in the rearview mirror. You can see the decision to do so behind us. And overall, we're not only going to connect our electrical power grid, but we're going to have smart roads. And those infrastructures are going to be managed and mediated, in my view, as a common infrastructure, as self-driving cars, which are in some cases are electrically powered, more and more will be. Even for those of us who like to drive vintage sports cars, that's not going to be the only thing we get to drive in a few years. Hopefully, we'll still be gasoline for them, but I wouldn't count on it. More and more, we're going to have self-driving vehicles, which are going to be operating on roadways where IT mediates their access to the roadways, just as it mediates when the electricity is put into their batteries. We're going to have to figure out how to manage that. And yes, that's going to be on a common IT infrastructure. And at some point, that IT infrastructure will be managed with cloud-based analytics. GE predicts, C3 IoT are doing that now. And eventually, the cloud will probably be the overall substrate for the IT infrastructure on which we depend. So we have to figure that out. The other thing that we have to realize is that not everybody views the IT infrastructure on which we depend as a global commons. Instead, they depend on it, they look at it perhaps as space that they might want to govern and even to control and make sovereign to themselves. And if we depend on it and we don't defend it as our space, somebody else may attack it and seize it and call it their space, in which case we will have an infrastructure glued to cyberspace that is no longer ours really to govern. I'm not saying that we should adopt that point of view, but we ought very carefully to consider the possibility that others are adopting that point of view. And that's something that is, I think, something that we're going to have to consider. I've talked about the battle for cyberspace. If you take that premise and accept it, then in essence, we've put our critical infrastructure on the battlefield. And that's something that we can decide to do, but if we do so, we need to understand the implications of it and how others, particularly our adversaries, some of whom may be near peers, view the situation. The last point that I would make as we're trying to get through this topic is, what's the difference between a cyber emergency and any other? And it was pointed out to me by somebody I respect very much that in the energy field, and Secretary Streit here may have comments on this, you know, the damage to the energy infrastructure from a natural disaster can be as bad, if not worse, as anything that we can imagine. And she and her colleagues are working heroically, I would add, to deal with the consequences of that. And they deserve our support and our respect and our thanks for what they're doing. The difference is this. A cyber attack is not an act of nature, it's an act of will. And because it's an act of will, it can be adaptive. I dealt with a cyber attack on a major industrial corporation a few years ago, and among the things we found is that as we deployed our defenses, our adversary watched what we were doing and adapted to our deployment and undertook a different way, adapted their exploit. So we're dealing with something that can have enormous ramifications like a natural disaster, but is volitional. It is an act of will. It is adaptive. It watches what we do. It may have planned for what we do. It may be watching how we intend to respond. It may have studied very, very carefully not only the infrastructure it attempts to attack or exploit, but it may have studied in advance and conducted surveillance on the likely attempts to deal with it, to respond to it, to overcome it, and to restore our systems. And I think that makes this a very different proposition. All right, so now you know something of my point of view, where I think we're coming from. As one would say, you know, am I right about this? I will echo the words of the former Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, who almost 200 years after the fact, when asked about his opinion of the French Revolution from 1789 to 1799, almost 200 years later, he is reputed to have said, "It is too soon to tell." So these are still early days. What is true in all of this may yet be too soon to tell. With that, let me invite the first of our panelists, Secretary Devin Strait from the Department of Energy to make her introductory remarks, following which the other panelists will do the same, and we'll turn to our Q&A. So with that, Devin, over to you. Thank you.
So good morning. Thank you all. I'm actually going to speak from up here because I need a crutch and didn't think that you'd want to see me like this talking to you. So as mentioned, my name's Devin Strait. I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Security and Energy Restoration at the Department of Energy. Our office is both the sector-specific agency, which means that we are the interface with both the electricity industry and the oil and natural gas industry, insofar as we deal with emergencies that can affect the energy sector. We are also the Energy Support Function 12, which is the energy sector in the National Response Framework. So our office is basically an all-hazards office dealing with any kind of incident that would affect the U.S. energy infrastructure. And it was alluded earlier, we have spent the last more than a month dealing with hurricanes, but in the last year we have dealt with both natural disasters, hurricanes, as well as cyber incidents. So yeah, we've covered the gamut on it this year. It's been quite a year. So today, per the requests of our sponsors, I'm here to talk about public-private partnerships, the importance of them, and also about information sharing. But before we get into that, I want to give a few words about cyber. So cyber, I think, is by far the most worrisome threat that we face from the perspective of the energy sector. Recently, to get a handle on this, my office commissioned a study that was run by 3 of our national labs that put all of the hazards that the energy sector faces, both those that are natural and the adversarial threats, in context with each other along axes of the likelihood an event and the potential consequences of that event. Because it was important for me to be able to see those in context with each other. And perhaps not surprisingly, cyber threats and their potential impacts rose to the top of the list. That study, by the way, is in its final iterations, and I expect it to become available soon. And then you can all take a look at it and decide whether you agree with it or not. It was particularly interesting to do the interplay with industry, all of whom have similar types of heat maps, and be able to use it as an opportunity to engage our broader community towards a common vision of what the threats are that we need to deal with. Specifically with respect to cyber, there are a number of things I think that make it different. Sam alluded to some. The one that stands out to me is the challenge of identifying the onset of a cyber incident. With a hurricane or an earthquake or GMD or a physical attack, sometimes we can see it coming. Certainly, we know when it's occurring, and we can tell that it's happened, but that's not always the case with a cyber attack. And so response frameworks that are predicated on our ability to know that it is happening or that it has happened are going to face additional challenges that are not common to the other types of incidents that we deal with. And I think that puts the question of information sharing and public-private partnerships in a different light and at a different level of importance. So let me talk about a few things that, that come to mind there. The first two are the most common issues that are brought up to me in terms of information sharing in cyber. And the first one is, Devin, we need to get more people clearances faster. And the other one is, Devin, we need to declassify more information faster. And I guess what I would say about that is both things would be great. They are both very significant challenges. And I think, at the risk of being terribly provocative, perhaps a little bit overblown, it certainly would be great to have more people with clearances, but clearances take a long time, and the moment somebody moves to a job, we have to start all over again. And classified information is often classified for a reason, and many agencies are involved in the classification of that information and thus the declassification as well. So I think we have to find some other alternatives to finding ways to talk amongst ourselves that don't immediately put us in the, we have to declassify the information and get more people clearances. I'm all for both of those things, but while we work that, I think there are other opportunities available to us that we really have to think about. So some of those involve automatic information sharing, and so I want to give a shout out to some of the programs that are being sponsored out of my office, a sibling office of mine, the office that does our cyber R&D. One of those is a program called CRISP, which is an acronym for Cybersecurity Risk Information Sharing Program. And it is a voluntary public-private partnership that's funded by industry, administered by the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the EISAC, and supported by DOE. And this was a system, if you will, of sensors that were developed by the Department of Energy and then transitioned out into the private sector to help give us insight into the types of cyber attacks that the electricity sector was facing. And it's actually proven to be enormously valuable. Even this year, it has proven its worth by helping us identify activity that was particularly focused on the electricity sector. That CRISP program involves sensors that were on the IT networks, but as we all know, the operational technology networks are even more critical to the energy sector. And so we are developing a follow-on program called Coyote, we get cute with these names, that will look at similar types of sensors that would be effective with on the operational side. And then just an additional shout out for some of the things that we're doing. Because these partnerships are so important to us, we work with both the Electricity Sector Coordinating Council and the Oil and Natural Gas Coordinating Council with regular meetings over the course of the year, and particularly with the ESCC R&D subcommittee that helps us identify technology gaps and develop R&D programs to fit those. And recently, DOE announced $20 million in awards for new R&D projects that we work with our national laboratories and with industry, academia, and others to try to expand the impacts of these programs and help fill gaps. So lastly, I wanted to talk about the question of what we could do better to work together, public and private, to address cybersecurity issues. And I guess the headline, not surprisingly, is this isn't going to be easy. I recently attended a meeting of the Nayak Report, National Infrastructure Advisory Council. that came out with a list of recommendations that we should all take to improve the cybersecurity posture of the energy sector. And I will say that I generally agreed with all of their recommendations, and I was admonished that we couldn't do business as usual anymore in the face of these threats, to which I completely agree. And one of the comments that I made was, all right, we have all of these recommendations that we all basically agree with. Do we have a commonality in understanding what the root causes are that have kept us from addressing these issues in the past? Because it certainly wasn't, at least from my perspective, from lack of fairly good agreement on what we ought to be doing. And the answer from those who had done the study came back, yeah, the common, sort of the root causes are found in either liability issues, legal contractual issues, and privacy issues, right? And so I think as we look to this comment of not business as usual, we as a group are going to have to figure out how to address some pretty fundamental challenges that affect all of us. I think that there are many opportunities. I meet with companies regularly that have said, Devin, we're hoovering up information and we need to find better ways to share it with you. And I agree completely. But in order to do that, we are going to have to deal with legal issues, liability issues, privacy issues, et cetera. So it is not a simple challenge, but certainly in light of the potential consequences, I echo some of Sam's perspectives on this. It can't be business as usual, and that means both from the federal standpoint, from the state and local standpoint, and also from the industry side. So with that, I will be quiet until a little later.
I'm going to ask Cal Bowman to provide his comments. I think you know from your programs that he's the Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Homeland Security, the state of Maryland. And it is, I think, particularly important, given how we govern in this country and the important relationship that citizens have with their governments through their state governments, that the states are represented here today. So Cal, over to you, either from your seat or do you want to use the podium?
If you guys can hear me all right in the back, then I'm going to just talk from here, if that's okay, be a little more casual. And I kind of hope this is a two-way dialogue because I'm interested in learning a little bit more from the stakeholders too. As Mark said in the beginning, and I thought it was a terrific observation, this is not science fiction anymore, I think is what you said. One of the things that I'm looking at in my research now at the Naval Postgraduate School is really just the general acceleration of technology, the exponential acceleration of it. And what we look at is a very exponential line. If you look at either cryptocurrency or you look at automation, you look at artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, that curve is more of a hockey stick, right? As opposed to what we see in human adaptability to those technologies. So I'm going to zoom out for a minute, and I'm probably going to be one of the least technical guys here. I want to talk a little bit more about the policy and the why, the so what factor, why we're looking at this, how governments can get involved, or how our government system, how the state of Maryland is getting involved, and how we're creating partnerships with within the state and with the private and critical infrastructure sectors as well. So as I mentioned, that hockey stick curve of exponential technology growth is really far outpacing human ability to adapt to it. And that line is very much linear, right? And so there's a gap there, and that's a gap that we have to quickly recognize and ask, how do we define what the opportunities are, and how do you cushion the impacts of those technologies, and how do you harness the opportunities that they eventually create? Let me give you an example. I was talking to a colleague here who lives in Delaware. Many places in Delaware, my folks live in Delaware, especially the coastal communities. Their budgets, a big part of their budgets rely on parking meters, right? If you've ever taken a vacation in Rehoboth or Bethany Beach or wherever, you know you're paying that meter when you're going out to dinner or if you're going to the beach every 2 hours. That's a big part. So what happens when automation, self-driving cars, electric cars become the standard and we start phasing out the combustible engine? And I think it's rapidly happening a lot faster than any of us are anticipating or even admitting to ourselves that it could happen. So then all of a sudden you have this gap. You have a town whose budget is now down possibly 50%. That's just one small example. I mentioned artificial intelligence. I talked about crypto, automation. But the underlying linchpin between all of this is cybersecurity. And so how does, when the governor asks or your mayor asks, so what? That's kind of the so what. You know, we estimate $400 billion a year in cyber attack costs to business, to governments, exceeds that. You know, I like to use the analogy, people keep looking for the cyber or the digital Pearl Harbor, and I equate it is that, you know, we're not going to see that, or hopefully we never see that. But what we are experiencing right now is death by 1,000 cuts. We are slowly being drained from these attacks that are reported or not reported, many times not reported, to the point where our infrastructure can no longer handle the burden of those costs. Not only the private sector, but especially in, I'm sorry, not only the public sector, but especially in the government systems. So what do we do about that? And my comments are that William Egger said technology's true power is the ability to facilitate the process of co-creation. And so that's the approach that we are going to take in creating a cyber system in Maryland, is co-creating. Many of you may have heard the term prosumer. That's the consumer being a part of the product and being a development partner in the product. So we're going to take a look at different models and different methods to develop a cyber system. And I think one of those is taking a look at the mission model canvas. You have to really understand and have a good comprehension of who your key partners are, who your beneficiaries are, and probably most important out of all of that are, what is the value proposition there? Because the value proposition that you're gonna notice is completely different for each of those beneficiaries or key partners or key resources that you're gonna rely on to develop that system. And so one thing in my former job, one of the first things I did was I went around to each local jurisdiction in Maryland, in central Maryland, and I would ask their Cisco or I would ask their information technology guys, say, hey, what are you guys doing for cyber? How much are you investing in it? What's the vulnerability? What's the problem? Oh, we can't tell you that. I say, okay, well, why can't you tell me? Well, it's private. And this is 4 or 5 years ago. Well, we just can't share that information. I get it. You know what, 5 years ago, I thought, you know, I just don't think they know what they're doing. At this point, we just don't know how to define the problem or what the problem is. So fast forward a couple months ago, and I'm the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor for the governor, and I go around the state agencies, and I conduct my interviews, whether it's with the National Guard or the state police, and I say, what are you doing in cyber? What kind of investment are we making? What are your problems? How can we help? Where do you need support? And one thing that I learned is they're much more willing. We are much more willing to talk about the challenges we face, the vulnerabilities we have. But the problem that I still see is there are these silos, right? There are these walls where I say, hey, did you know that the Attorney General's office may have the same vulnerability? Or that Maryland State Police and the National Guard share these different critical vulnerabilities? And the answer is usually no, didn't know that. And B, what resources are you bringing to the table to fight those vulnerabilities, to close that gap? Oh, well, we're doing X, Y, Z. Well, you know what, so are they. And how much are you spending for that? Oh, we're spending, you know, $1 million. I'm just making a number up. Well, you know what, so are they. So now we're tasked with identifying, what the goal should be to identify common vulnerabilities across government systems. And where the public sector and the private sector kind of combine and kind of come into play together is the value proposition for the energy sector, for water, for all of our lifeblood systems, are not really far off from each other. So if we're able to identify and tightly define, aggressively define what those vulnerabilities are, what those common and shared vulnerabilities are, then we could start developing the measures and the needed task to close those gaps, to provide the resources across that whole community, if you will. It's a much more holistic approach. And so it requires you to develop a learning loop. You build a variation, you test it out with your customer base. You say, does this work? Yes or no? No. Come back and say, okay, we're going to go at it again. We're going to develop another prototype of this model. We call it the mission model canvas. Many of you may have heard of it. It's a direct result of the business model canvas, which is a startup model. But what it does is it allows you to be agile. It allows you to be flexible and to pivot based on the adversary. And as we heard earlier, our adversaries are very adaptive. And so to be responsive to that, we need to have a mechanism and a framework in place that allows us to be loose and flexible with our cyber approach. So with that, I'll yield the rest of my time, and I look forward to questions and further conversations about it.
Thank you, Cal, and very helpful and insightful. Brian Moran could not join us today, but Isaac Janak, who's the Cybersecurity Program Manager in the Office of the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security from the Commonwealth of Virginia, has consented to join us. I'm also going to expect that you're going to be operating from your seat because I think you have just emerged from a broken foot.
Ow.
Don't do that again.
I'll try not to.
Isaac, over to you.
All right, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think our greatest concern in the Commonwealth is the threat to critical infrastructure. The advanced persistent threat is real. Admiral Rogers, who is the commander of Cybercom and the director of the National Security Administration, often says it's not a matter of if but when, and I think that has a lot of truth to it. From our perspective in Virginia, a lot of the critical infrastructure throughout the state are owned and operated at the local or local regional level. And when we look at those infrastructures, whether they're water, wastewater facilities, elections facilities, what have you, power co-ops, they either are not aware of the threat or don't have the capability or resources to meet the threat. And so that's an area that we're really focusing on in Virginia. We're very fortunate to have a governor who's passionate about cybersecurity. If you've ever heard him talk, economy is number one, and then a close second to cybersecurity. In the first couple weeks of his administration, he signed an executive order to form the Virginia Cybersecurity Commission, which led the development of a number of our key policies, legislation, and initiatives. The commission was composed of both cabinet secretaries within the governor's office, but also a whole host of subject matter experts from industry. And they looked at 5 core areas: economic development, workforce development, cyber awareness, and then from the public safety perspective, cyber crime and infrastructure protection, which is pertinent to today. So we ran the commission for 2 years, and they created a report and issued their recommendations. And a lot of those have since translated into our key initiatives in the Commonwealth today. Public safety, we oversee 11 different agencies, anywhere from emergency management to state police to the Virginia National Guard. So we have a broad swath of agencies that deal with all hazards. The common ones are the terrorist threat, or hurricanes is a regular issue, but cyber has since increased as a concern for us. And we've really taken a comprehensive look at that. So I just want to go into a couple of initiatives that we've begun in Virginia. The Virginia Fusion Center, we formed a cyber intelligence unit to increase information sharing and gathering with our local partners, federal partners, state partners, and then also with the private sector. They were just formed this year, and so we're doing a lot of work with them to get them stood up. We're also fortunate in Virginia to have the National Guard, who has a tremendous cyber capability. They actually just formed the first, I believe it's the nation's first cyber brigade. And so that's composed of a number of different states, but really it's commanded by the Virginia National Guard. So that's a tremendous opportunity for us. For the past couple of years, we've actually had the National Guard conducting cyber assessments of our local and state networks. And so they're a huge capability that we can bring in to do a third-party assessment of how well we're doing security, but also providing it to our local partners as a free service to them to help them improve their security. And then thirdly, we gathered a number of our critical public safety agencies, but also our technologies agency, and developed our Commonwealth of Virginia Cyber Emergency Response Plan. And that's very central to how we will react during a cyber incident should a critical infrastructure be impacted by a cyber incident. That plan kind of dictates, number one, what are the roles and responsibilities for responding agencies? 2, how will those agencies be notified? And then 3, how they will coordinate to respond, investigate, and remediate the cyber incident. So that's kind of the perspective that we're taking in Virginia, and I will yield my time, but I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank you for coming in on such short notice and making your way here through the vicissitudes of a broken foot. And
Absolutely.
appreciate very much the insights of your state as well. Our last but certainly not least panelist is William Anderson, who comes from the National Academies. So I suspect you doubled the IQ when you walked into this room. What's that old line? There haven't been so much raw intelligence here since Thomas Jefferson dined here alone, said John Kennedy to the Nobel Prize laureates. Bill is a senior program officer, Transportation Research Board at the National Academies, and therefore I think he's probably doing the deepest and best thinking on how our transportation infrastructure is evolving and what are the threats to it. So let me turn it over to you. Are you going to sit, or do you
Yeah,
want
I'm
to
just going to sit here. I'm
Great, thank you.
much more of a relaxed type of person than getting up there. But in my old days, I used to be a professor, so if you see me fidgeting around, that's just because I'm getting into the teacher mode and I like to walk around. So I hate podiums. Anyways, I have been working with the Transportation Research Board for a couple of years now. And we were founded about almost 100 years ago, just to give you a little bit background of what TRB is. So National Academies was to bring together all these bright, intelligent researchers and talking about these particular problems that we're addressing here today in this particular room, and come up with the brightest ideas to address that on a national level and get it down to the states. Because that's what the whole idea was behind Abraham Lincoln establishing the National Academies of Sciences. So we continue to do that as one of the largest divisions in the National Academies of Sciences, that's TRB. Every year we bring together about 13,000 of our closest friends in January for our annual meeting in Washington, D.C., and talk about a broad swath of problems and issues that our transportation industry is facing. And we also do it in partnership with many of our other lifeline partners, like the energy sector, for example, which is an affiliate member of the Transportation Research Board. But primarily, our funding and focus is on the state issues. You've heard from 2 of our states, and were they really talking about exactly transportation? No. They were talking about it as a whole statewide issue across all of their agencies, and that's exactly what we have to deal with as well. Many of our state DOTs are following the lead of what some other agency within the governor's office, within the National Guard, within some other unit. There are all kinds of ways of dealing with this particular problem at the state level. Not one state is mirroring another state, basically. So dealing with the wide variety that is out there has always been able to find the most creative solutions. So it's a good thing. It may be a bit difficult to wield and maneuver within, but it's always proven to be a good thing. Now, when we are talking about it in transportation, as far as cybersecurity issues, we're not really looking at it as one particular problem, because we address all hazards, all modes, all the time. That's how we look at this particular problem. TRB has 220 committees Not one of them is titled cybersecurity. We have an executive committee, which is sort of like our board of directors for all of our committees and the structure of TRB. They have a task force, which is dealing with transformational technologies. They have a subcommittee, which is cybersecurity. That's how we're structured. So we're looking at these transformational technologies, which will apply to every single mode of transportation. And that could even apply to the walkers, the pedestrians. How are we dealing with those particular things? Because think about it. The blind rely on the technology to cross a street in many cases. The audible signals at the crosswalks make it safe. Can you play with that? Everybody has a trust within the technologies applied to our vehicles, to our homes, to our computers. That brings me to the other point. So what's the future of transportation? We've already brought it up. The automated vehicle, driverless vehicles. Well, right now we're calling that the connected and automated vehicles because there's two different views at this point. You have the connected vehicle and you have an automated vehicle. The difference, how many of you had the car park for you, parallel park? How many of you have that within your vehicle? There's a few, all right? That's automation. The car takes over and does the service for you. Those are what you're supposed to do. Connected vehicles, those are vehicles that have sensors and communication devices within the vehicles communicating to either other vehicles on the road or the roadside technology. So while you're passing by, your vehicle's communicating whether or not your windshield wipers are on, whether or not you have slippery situations on the road, whether or not you're using your turn signal or your lights. All of that information is being shared and collected so that we can have safer roads. And we're doing it in a way where the information of the car owner is not shared. So there is a privacy and liability concern there still. But we're moving in that direction where connected and automation is going to be one single thing. We're going to have cars that'll drive by itself. And why is this? We want safety. We want security. We want better efficiencies. But what do we know if we have better efficiencies? Because we want less congestion, we actually increase the number of vehicles that are on the road, usually at that point. So it is very important that we move in that direction of having electrified vehicles on the road or some other mechanism by which we fuel our cars. Because yes, there is research out there right now on solar roads surfaced with solar technology that you can actually fuel and operate the vehicle. It's interesting. So there are other ways of looking at this. So keeping that all in mind, there is a wide variety of options being considered right now for the future, all of which are taking into consideration the security elements of their connectivity. They're sharing that information basically with their trusted partners. They're not really doing it in an open environment where it's going to be better for the general population. We need to move in that direction. We have ITS America, which is the Intelligent Transportation Society of America, a nonprofit association. We have ITE, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and we have AASHTO, which is the senior officials, basically, for the state DOTs. All of them are talking right now on how they can create a public-private partnership where they can start sharing some of that information back and forth about the cybersecurity, research about the applications, about what the threats are. They're going to do that in a trusted network and create sort of like a center of excellence is what we like to call them. You're probably familiar with those. So as long as we can move in that direction, then we'll be able to get down to a place where this security element can be added into the technology development much more quickly. But think about how you use your cell phone today. That's basically how you're going to be using your vehicle in the future. You're already seeing Ford partnering up with Lyft, for example. They're going to take the Lyft technology and put that into Ford vehicles. So you already have the TNCs working with the car manufacturers. So a potential path into the automation is going to be through the shared mobility world. That's one potential option. There are others. Last point I want to raise with all of this is the AI intelligence, artificial intelligence. That's even further out. But it is a piece that's already being worked on. Think about what I told you about how we're working on cybersecurity across all the modes, dealing with all hazards all the time. We already have an AI subcommittee within our committee structure, which is further along than our cybersecurity work, because it's not brought into one of our resilience committees yet. That's something else. They have been working on the AI networks and interests longer than they have been within a collaborative network for cybersecurity. That's interesting. It's very interesting. What does that tell us? This is really driven on commerce and services for the people. That's what we're really looking at here. So how is that going to really affect transportation in the future? That makes the whole public-private partnership that much more important. So I think that's all I really need to say today, because I think I just wanted to give you as much information out there. I guess I should make one other point. I want to give you as much information for thought thinking around this particular area, because that's what we do within TRB. We think a lot. So keep in mind that the transportation network is one of the few infrastructure systems that has been utilized as a weapon on more than one occasion. You had Oklahoma, where that was a rental truck. You had a USS Cole, small watercraft vessels. You had 9/11, of course, aviation, plenty of examples globally where buses are used. And today, vehicle ramming is popular. Just keep that in mind. What happens when you can take over a vehicle and have full control of it?
Well, on that cheerful note, I have a whole list of questions which we spent a good deal of time trying to generate in advance. And of course, listening to the panel, I am tempted to take these questions. I'm waiting to see Larry come out of his chair and discard them completely, but I won't. However, I am going to modulate the questions a little bit based on the comments that we've seen. The first question I want to pose is really about the threat. And I want to ask it in this way. How serious is the threat to our critical infrastructures? What changes are we seeing to the cyber threat to our critical infrastructures? Are we seeing any changes as those infrastructures begin to converge, particularly energy and transportation? Are those threats and the changes to those threats being manifest in the technology of those cyber threats, and or maybe how they're being operated, the tradecraft by which those threats are being deployed? So again, is the threat changing? How serious is it? Is it related in any way to the convergence of these infrastructures? Maybe the changes might be evident both in the technology and in how they're being operated and maybe even adapted. Not entirely clear how I want to start, so I'm just going to let you take your shot.
I'll take the first shot across the bow here. So I think what's extremely difficult for us is to either own or develop like this foresight capacity, right? The ability to think about what does cyber look like in 10 years from now. Because I mentioned earlier, we're very linear in our adaptation of technology. So I think addressing the linear changes to cyber as it happens every day, we're okay at. We can do that job. But I think it's the bigger, what does cyber look like 10 years down the road based on what is the emerging tech, the disruptive technologies? You had a different word for it, transformational, I think.
Yes.
Looking at those and then saying, all right, using cyber as the lens you're looking through, what does it look like then? And that, in that way, if you're able to do that, then you're able to really invest in harnessing those opportunities that they create. And I don't think you can do that without developing or giving yourself the space or the time to say, you know what, we're going to think about the problems, how they may exist down the road and not how they exist today or based on the attack from yesterday.
Bill?
I would agree basically what you're saying, because it is that transformational piece. And since you really don't know what the network is really going to look like, and like I was saying, there are lots of different avenues to get there. There are many states that are just making the decisions to play it by ear, deal with the issue that you have at today, address that, but then look at where your larger investment needs to go for your next step forward, because we are dealing with this from a on-demand delivery issue. We are looking at this from the vehicle owner issue. We are looking from a shared mobility and social equity issue. There are many different ways to get at this particular problem, and there are many different offices, agencies, divisions within the transportation agencies which have different responsibilities for these pieces as well. So the governance is at risk when we move too quickly and address the technology before it should be properly addressed.
But are we seeing changes in the technology are we seeing changes in the threat that are anticipatory? One of the things I think you find about cyber adversaries is they're not generally stupid. They don't, always shoot to, they shoot to where they think the puck is going to be. That's where they go. Do you think that they are watching the research and development that we're doing in our infrastructures and not just asking, how can I exploit these infrastructures, but what should I be doing 2 or 3 years from now? These are intelligence services. Devin?
Without a doubt.
And how do we, what evidence do we have of that behavior that you can share?
I mean, I think it does, excuse me, I don't think it, I'm loud. Can you hear me? There you go. My husband will tell you I don't need a microphone. I think that it's common sense, right? I mean, it's what we as humans in an adversarial environment will do what we can and be limited by what we can imagine and what we can do. And so I think you can follow the news and get a good view on what we can do, and then let your imagination play, right? I mean, I think the question is pretty obvious, if I could.
I have to agree, if only because one evidence that our adversaries can think into the future is that we don't see so much evidence of them catching up to our defenses. We see ourselves trying to deploy defenses that catch up to their exploits and to their attacks. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we need to, rather than trying to secure our networks, build in resilience and accept that the adversaries already compromised our systems. We're also seeing infrastructure that is increasingly interconnected. We are currently doing a study with Homeland Security on our data centers in northwestern Virginia, and seeing if there was a massive power outage, how long would they be able to sustain that outage, and how would they be able to get fuel to those centers to be able to continue to operate. And that includes transportation, that includes, of course, power, and a number of other sectors. So I think we need to look at this more of the adversary's already in, what can we do to be able to bounce back from a degraded state and get back to operations quickly.
Let me turn it on the other side now for a second. I appreciate that. I think that's right. This is a hard question because even as I read it, I wish we'd phrased it differently. The question as written is, what are the key vulnerabilities of these infrastructure sectors? Do they have adequate planning in place to address these vulnerabilities? What's needed to harden our critical infrastructure and prepare for potential crisis? I would add, what are the vulnerabilities that we anticipate as the infrastructures evolve? And not just harden them, but how can we make them more resilient? Devin,
So I think that our greatest vulnerability, to do the cliche, is our greatest strength, right? Most cyber attacks occur because some individual human being clicks on the wrong email, opens the wrong attachment, right? And so that, and I think studies have shown that no matter how much training you do, there is going to be some set of the population that on that one day forgets and clicks, and that's the entrance then occurs. So I think that even in the face of the evolving sophistication of the technology, one of our vulnerabilities is that we humans are in this particular loop. And I think that speaks to my colleague's point about building resiliency and assuming that you are either going to be compromised, or if you really are going to be honest about it, you probably have been compromised, and take it from there. I think one of the ways that we can, so two of the areas I think that we need to work on is this machine-to-machine information sharing, and the ability to find ways for our systems to make decisions faster than we can, so that we can identify what bad stuff is coming at us and shunt it out of the system, because we are going to need those types of protections in addition to the sort of standard mantra of do our cyber hygiene. And as much as I hate to say it, because I get frustrated that we say it often, do your cyber hygiene, we are still in a level of maturity where more cyber hygiene would actually make a tremendous amount of difference in terms of our ability to withstand attack.
we call this, by the way, the Dave problem. There's a classic cartoon. I teach at Georgetown as an adjunct, and it shows it shows a boxing ring, and in one corner you have cyber defenses and antivirus and intrusion detection and intrusion protection and security information event management systems, and in the other corner you have, it's entitled Human Error, Dave.
But in
And
defense,
Dave's tough.
but in defense of Dave, right? Our adversaries are getting very sophisticated in how they talk to Dave. So they find Dave, who is the head of human resources, and they send Dave a resume. Can you fault Dave, right? They figure out what Dave's wife's name is, and they send Dave an email from his wife.
So this goes to the operational art, not just the technological art. And we have seen our adversaries become operationally very, very sophisticated. Bill, you had a comment.
That is one of the biggest problems that everybody deals with. I mean, it's across the board. But the other problem is this definition of criticality, because that's a perspective. Take Dallas area rapid transit, for example, DART. So they were hacked unknowingly. They were hacked. The intruder actually was able to get all of their operational data and hold it ransom. So they were basically saying, you got to pay us X dollars, and we'll give you your data back. They didn't have a backup. So obviously, DART is not, it's not really a critical piece, but to the people who are transit dependent, it is critical. To the city and other functions and other ways, it is very critical. Just the knowledge of having the story out there is critical. They worked out all of the issues on their end, and you can do the research and find the news articles on that. But because of that, we discovered that there is this difference within this criticality piece. So protecting your data and being aware that this is a critical piece for your operations, because otherwise you can't operate. All that information is really important. It's all your scheduling, it's all your timing, it's your staff information, your driver's information. All of that's really critical to the operations of your transit system. It's important. Others have learned from that. They backed up their data. Others have had the ransom issues dealt with, but they basically said, we got a backup, we're fine.
Let me turn to the question of how we address the problem. The question is written, and we all vet these questions, and then you think about them in the sober light of day. What investment is required to modernize and is necessary isolate our systems to stay ahead of the threat? And embedded in that question is the idea that isolating the systems is an approach to mitigating them. And that, by the way, is not an assumption that I'm necessarily prepared to adopt. I think it may be too late for that. So I'd modify the question by saying what investment is required to modernize and to protect our systems. And I'd extend it by asking, should we be doing more research and development? We're certainly developing new IT infrastructures and new IT systems. Do we have are we conducting the R&D necessary to protect it? Or are we essentially delivering cars and delivering brakes 6 months later? And I'd be curious to hear what kind of investments we ought to be making, not just in R&D, but including it.
So
Go ahead,
I'll
please.
say, besides the financial investment, there also, I think, needs to be a philosophical discussion had and an investment in changing the way we consider how we deliver these services, whether it's the government delivering it to critical infrastructure or any other private sector. And that is, at some point, do we reject the one-way delivery model of the government and start saying, recognizing that cyber inherently is intertwined. There's really, in cyber, there's no regard for borders or silos or self-inflicted silos, for that matter. And if you take a step back and say, how do we then define the problem and what do we want to invest in based on the rationale of what's the value proposition for critical infrastructure and what's the value proposition for government sectors, I think you're going to find a lot of commonalities that will then allow you to kind of shift your philosophy to say that one-way delivery service does not work. It needs to be co-created together.
So how would we focus our investment? What specifically might we do? And where do the resources come from? Most of the critical infrastructure in our country is owned in the private sector. But we look to government to protect us. The protection of our nation is a societal good. It's not something that we necessarily do just on our own. Devin?
So I think there are two thoughts that make this particularly complicated. As you pointed out, it's a private sector issue. So to the extent that and economists in the room can correct me on my terminology, but to the extent that we can capture the risk and the liability in an insurance premium, right, then we can start to use the economics of the risk to drive investment. I think one of the challenges comes, as you pointed out, because cyber attack being adversarial, can have both a criminal or potentially a nation-state component to it. And that makes that puts us in an entirely different place about internalizing risk and liability in those instances, right? So many of my energy utilities say, look, we're going to do all of our due diligence to protect ourselves from criminal risk, but the moment you start talking to me about anything beyond that, that's not my problem. But I'm not sure that it's clear how we're going to deal with that. So I didn't answer your question. I just made it more difficult.
Thank you for that.
You're so
welcome. And it's only Wednesday, but still, again, portraying perhaps a point of view. In 2015, was it, the Office of Science and Technology Policy developed a federal government cyber R&D strategic plan. And a number of us, including those of us at INSA, served essentially as agent provocateur in questioning OSTP, why it didn't involve a greater participation from the private sector. given that we think the private sector owns most of the infrastructure that has to be protected, and it's also the source of most of the technology on which that infrastructure depends. So why wasn't there a more explicit connection to a sort of whole of nation strategy, essentially what we did after the Second World War for nuclear power and for aerospace science and engineering? And I think the answer we got is, we get your point, early days, we'll get there. But given what you've said about the threat, it doesn't seem to me that we really have that much time to wait. So I again put the question, if we were to start to make an investment, how might we structure it, and where might we apply it? I know this is a hard question, but it gets to the doing part. It goes beyond how tough the problem is to getting at dealing with it.
It's almost like a joke, almost, if you start saying a lawyer enters a bar, an engineer enters a bar, and it's almost that kind of a setup. It depends on who you're talking to on your perspective. So a lawyer will give you a different answer than what an engineer would give you an answer. And I don't think we're going to be able to answer that on this particular stage, and perhaps that's particularly something to look at from the exercise as the next stage of this. But an engineer will basically tell you, why aren't we requiring it to be addressed during the planning and design of infrastructure? Why are we always coming back at this as a retrofit or a solution set after you've added the technology in? There's a traffic engineer here today who talks about this from the cabinet perspective. Those things on the side of the roads at intersections which actually control the signals and some of the other devices around that particular area. I mean, those are systems which you can walk up and hack. I mean, just connect in. I mean, you have now ways of keeping that from happening, but there aren't all of the cabinets up to that snuff yet. So you look at it from different perspectives and to get different answers. I will fall back then to say there is the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's a place to start. And when considering what is that framework, how are you going to roll in these pieces of R&D and fund it? Because there you have a clear audience, a clear structure to work from, at least.
And I think you can look to where, so cybersecurity is one of our secretary's 3 priorities. And within that, I think you can look to how one of my sibling offices is making investments, and those investments are in faster, better information sharing. For us, it's specific to the operational technology side because we're worrying about the energy sector, but and in machine-to-machine connections, and then exploring other ways to to investigate supply chain issues, which keep me up at night, and other opportunities. So if we go and we look at, for example, these $20 million of research grants, that's probably a good synopsis of how the government is looking at R&D priorities. Granted that it's not a huge amount of money, but.
Is any of that going to connect to the grid modernization consortium effort underway at the labs?
It is.
That makes excellent sense. All right. I'm going to ask one more question here and then turn this over to the rest of you for Q&A. And given that there are more questions than we can possibly address in the time allotted, let me try to converge, since that's part of our theme today, a few of the questions. There are a number of approaches to managing cybersecurity programs as well as incidents. There is the C2M2 model, which the Department of Energy is the champion. Some industry users are using managed security models. Others are trying to use their own. Sitting alongside this as a separate but related issue is the question of information sharing. What information is useful? How should it be delivered? How effective is the information sharing mechanisms that we have in place today? What can be done to make them better? So to try to get two questions in one, the way I would ask this question is, what should we do in terms of the development of cybersecurity management models? And at the same time, what can we do to improve the state of information sharing? Or do we think it's simply working very well and we should proliferate the current approach? I'm going to start with our friends from Maryland and Virginia, and then ask our federal participants to follow up.
So, in my opinion, I think the most important thing that we could do as a state, and this goes for the feds as well, is understanding and realizing we are under fiscal constraints. I'm very fortunate I have a governor who considers cybersecurity of one of the highest priorities for the state. That being said, we still have to really rigorously identify who our key partners are, the ones who will be in sharing the responsibilities of addressing our cybersecurity approach. They're all going to have different value propositions, which means they're all going to have different mission costs and budgets inherent to that. That's going to really dictate, what the cost is, how you can understand and identify those common vulnerabilities, as I said, which will then, I think, ultimately lead to achievement in whatever that mission is. However, without that first step in identifying the key stakeholders, and those key stakeholders are not just state partners. Those are local and private. Those are critical infrastructure. They all have to come into the fold, and they all have to kind of lay it on their table. Here's our value proposition. Here's where it's beneficial for us. Here's where our vulnerabilities lie, and here's how we can help the state, and the state can help us.
Fair enough.
I would just add two things. First, I think we need to do a better job of improving trust amongst our partners. We do have existing relationships with, Homeland Security, FBI, private sector, but I think there's always room for improvement to better share that information, ensure that we're not going to use that information to slap you on the wrist or anything like that, but really use it to your benefit. And then the second thing, it's not just about information sharing, but it's also applying the information. I was just in a forum with a number of our local partners yesterday, and they say they get all the information they could use. It's just a matter of them being able to ingest that information, actually do something with it. So I think that's key to this whole conversation.
And if I could add to that just a little bit too, we have a great fusion center in the state of Maryland who's very, very good at collecting and analyzing information. However, I think the data set changes based on the customer that it's going to be provided to. And I think the other thing missing from that also is that intel cycle is reciprocal, right? They are relying on other stakeholders to provide them the intel that they need for them to be able to analyze it and redistribute it. And I'm afraid that part of that gap has kind of gone missing over the past few years. I think we really need to get stronger in understanding that an intelligence cycle is two ways and not just them feeding us analyzed information.
Does the NIST framework help in maybe the development not just of standards, but of maybe the development of management models as well? Is that a place where we might achieve some common ground across several critical infrastructure sectors?
For me, the common ground in NIST is using the standards, not necessarily the management tools within it.
Okay.
I don't have much comment to that.
Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to allow members of the audience, the rest of you, to join us, even people named Dave. I've got a couple of friends out here named Dave. I would ask that you keep your question as focused as possible, and also that you speak as clearly as possible, giving the panel members an opportunity to hear you and to respond.
Hi, this is David Winks with AccuSite. And this is actually a question for Devin. It appears that some pipeline operators are being urged by EPA emission regulations to convert compressor stations to electric power grid instead of using natural gas, which creates a dependency on the grid for the gas pipeline system. How do you perhaps suggest that maybe DOE and the national security concerns work with folks like EPA to give regulatory relief for those types of compressor stations? How do you adjudicate that?
So I'm going to take a pass on that one because it's just not in my area of expertise at all to talk about the how to work with the regulator on that kind of issue. Sorry, I can take the question for the record, as it were, and find someone who can answer it, but that's just not my area of expertise.
How are you? Sunny Sinha, and thank you so much for doing a great panel, and Chuck, thanks for organizing this. Very timely question. I work with Dragos, Robert M. Lee. We were the ones who actually reverse engineered the crash override malware in Ukraine. We've been working with a lot of larger energy sector partners, and we're really encouraged to see everybody coming together to try and answer these questions on how can we share information quickly, how can we do the analysis, how can we make that contextually. Problem is that I think that there is a wide swath of understanding and capability between your larger energy sector companies and your smaller ones. We are trying very hard to address the smaller energy sector issue. I was really encouraged to see the Coyote program and trying to layer on ICS-specific things, but we are right now the only player with this ICS capability. Two questions. One is, if you knew that there was attack coming in 2 years that might have some type of effect on our homeland, how would you do things differently? And number two is, what is the timeline for the Coyote program? How can small startups like us be more involved in the fold as we have built a scalable model to address this?
I'm going to reconsider coming. These are hard questions. The Coyote program is run by Hank Kensington, my colleague. I will get you specifics about the timeline for participation because I don't know them off the top of my head. But I know there is enormous eagerness to have participation, the industry participation in the development of that system. We believe firmly that we can't do anything without industry participation. How would we... So I'm going to dodge a little bit the answer to the first question, which was how would we do something differently if we knew 2 years out there was an attack coming? I mean, I think it's fair to say that we know now that 2 years from now there is some kind of attack coming from someone somewhere. So I think we will continue to do, we're going to continue to do what we can to develop better information sharing technologies, to put more capability into the system, because one of our concerns is that that our industry partners all are basically relying on the same set of companies to provide them support. And so in the event of something that affected many, many companies, there might not be enough assistance to go around. To practice, I think we don't do enough state and regional exercises that involve cyber incidents. GridX is coming up. Obviously, we are major participants in that, but one of the things that I'm trying to get my office to do is to sponsor regional cyber exercises so that we can help those both companies, utilities, and state and regional organizations that aren't as perhaps sophisticated as the two who are sitting next to me to participate in exercises and practice how we would do this. Because one of the things about cyber, as I think you illustrated in talking about the various committees and many companies, et cetera, is that it is dispersed. It doesn't typically sit one place in any entity. And so we all have to learn how to, we just have to practice learning how to pull all of our different resources together to address it. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that's probably the best I can do.
And it might not answer the question, but I do want to add on to that training and exercise piece too, is as I said earlier, I think cyber is a linchpin to a lot of the vulnerabilities we face today, especially when it's not related to natural disasters. So I would say that any sort of exercise, whether it's a regional, a state, a local, should have some sort of cyber element embedded into
Yes,
it or built
absolutely.
into it. And I don't think we see that enough.
And for the benefit of our press friends here, don't take what I said as I am talking about one specific thing that we know of 2 years out. I'm talking broadly and generally that, you know, they're coming at us all the time, so it's fair enough to say that they'll still be coming at us all the time 2 years from now.
Are we gonna, do we think we'll see changes, say 2 years down the road in the infrastructure that are gonna make us, that should compel us to adopt different strategies or tactics? Forgetting about the difference in the attack, what about differences in the infrastructure, particularly as they converge?
So I think you're starting to see a lot more, everybody is interested in collecting data, right? And the more data you have, the better information you have, the better you can provide services, or for the public sector, the better way you can collect revenue. I think that data is forcing infrastructure to go smart. And so whether it's going to be relaying pipe for water system and sewage, I think all of that data is going, or all of those smart technologies that are going to be built into the infrastructure will require a new layer of protection, and recognizing that there are new vulnerabilities coming alongside of it. I don't think anybody said, and I can't believe it, the Internet of Things today. There, I said it. If you had 2 hours on your watch, it's been said. But it's true. You know, the more things that these devices are connected, and I think that goes to infrastructure as well, we have to recognize that's just another layer that's going to be required for us to invest in and address.
Initiatives out there like the Smart Cities initiatives, and they're really going to drive the direction that you're referencing. So you'll see that there is the interest from the public sector to work with the private sector through these particular types of initiatives on these concerns. It is to the best interest of the community for utilizing its limited resources. I mean, that's what they're relying on with these types of interconnectivity programs.
Very good. Another question.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, panel. I have a big concern that we're still thinking about this in terms of when and if the adversaries attack, or they're attacking constantly. I mean, I think everybody in this room probably would accept that there's already some percentage of command and control that our adversaries already own. So they're already in, they're already capable, they can already shut us down. Now, what percentage, how much they have, it's, you know, it's a debate in every community. At what point in time do we as cyber professionals and we as industry, government come together and marry with the manufacturing side and say it's not acceptable to have 6 to 9 months to get power generation assets, to get distribution assets, generators, capacitors, the kinds of things that we need to reconstitute our energy generation capability when it goes down? I think we're collecting a lot of great information. We've got great tools that talk about how we can defend and create resiliency. But when you have no electricity to drive that resiliency, you're at a real standstill. So at what time do we in this side get married with our manufacturing partners and start to look at that trusted foundry approach, that trusted manufacturing approach, that manufacturing approach that says invest in manufacturing here to have the assets when it goes down?
Implicit in that question is that we're not, and I'm not entirely sure members of the panel would share that assumption. Members?
I would just say, you know, not just working with the manufacturers, but expecting that you're not going to have replacements within 6, 9, 12 months, you know, and planning for that is also just as critical.
So I would agree. I think we are, maybe not to the extent that we would like to be, but we are beginning to work with the manufacturers. I am aware of, so DOE has an advanced manufacturing office. They are looking to team with the Department of Defense on looking at how you address some of the issues that you mentioned in terms of being able to manufacture items that we can trust are safe and secure. I am looking at working with our national laboratories to set up additional capabilities that would help address supply chain issues from a cyber perspective. I think there's a lot of nascent work there and more to be done.
Right. Another question.
Hi, David Heyman, Smart City Works. Thank you for your comments this morning. One of the things that I think resonates from all of your comments is that this can't be and isn't business as usual. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity to take off your seatbelt and not answer business as usual. What are the policies, capabilities, or relationships, if you could, that would be game changers to you in terms of your relationships and activities today? What are the things that you would want that you can't get today but that would be game changers? Policy, capabilities, or relationships? Thank you.
Tough question.
Liability, privacy.
So let's say there's an open checkbook, right?
That one.
I am really interested in learning how we can do not only mitigation but recovery better. Not only better, but smarter. And did you say you work for Smart Cities? You're with Smart Cities? Okay. So, one of the things that I like to look at is if something failed the first time or the second time there, why are we doing that same thing again? Why are we rebuilding there? Why are we recovering in the same spot, putting up the same building when we could be changing the score of the game, right? That would be the game changer. So I guess then it becomes maybe a political question. And how do you get politics out of it? And I think maybe that's the underlying grand challenge to solve is how do you navigate the political water so that you can do the right thing, rebuild smarter, or do the mitigation strategy in a way that gives you the budget so that you don't have to worry about that being an issue, being a vulnerability, whatever that is, solve for N.
So speaking of the money, I sat in a meeting some years ago in which major IT companies were talking about the amount of investment they make in cybersecurity as a percentage of their operating budget or their income. And it dwarfs what the public sector and the taxpayer would probably be willing to foot the bill for. Right? So money is a big deal. And then are these other issues of that we all struggle with, right? We want our privacy, but being able to know exactly what's happening on our networks would certainly be helpful in terms of being able to identify attacks. But at what price are we willing to pay for that? So these are all balances that we have to make.
Something I would personally like, and this is pretty specific, is the death of username and password and the use of multi-factor authentication.
There you go.
I would then go back to thinking of what these particular answers and focuses were on and think about if you had a capability to identify what the greatest risk and consequence are and balance that out and compare what's your greatest return and plan to address your interdependencies issues. If you really had that tool that could do something like that, that's really valuable to make a difference on what could be done. So, but the first piece that would make that an important element is having the right policy in place of how to use it.
We're going to take one more question. I know there are more than one hand up, but I think the mic's been allocated. So, sir, you've got it.
Okay, thank you. Very lucky. My name is Rick Teen with Mission Secure. I'm actually very glad to hear that the OT layer has been mentioned by just about everybody up there, because too often it seems like all the focus is on protecting the IT layer. And but I am curious among you guys, do you feel that the appropriate balance within your agencies and the people you interact with is being struck between focusing on protecting the IT layer, but also the OT layer, because that's where some of these damages will really occur, especially as you said. I thought your comment was great about assuming you're already compromised. Well, once something's in the network, what can it do? And if you're protecting the OT layer, you can actually stop something even once it's inside. So just curious, among the group, do you feel like you and the people you deal with are balancing those two layers and the protection of those layers?
Bill, you want to take a shot? Want to start with it?
Well, I'm very unfair to ask that question because, I don't have those people. So we work with a lot of organizations that have those people. So the answer to it would vary, I guess. I would be surprised if somebody actually answered, yeah, we got this. But I would be happy to hear it. So
I won't answer, yeah, we got this, but at least from my office's perspective, I will say that our emphasis is on the OT piece, because that is the part that that's what's sector specific. The IT is shared across, and there are many, especially our friends in DHS and others, who are investing heavily in that, but our focus going forward is on the OT piece of it.
And with that, I want to ask you all to thank our panelists and for an excellent discussion. I appreciate it very much. And turn the podium over to our president, Chuck Alsop.
So I think we all expected that we were going to get a pretty interesting discussion today, and I think we got a great discussion. And as we mentioned before, we're going to take what came of this discussion, your questions, and feed that into a tabletop exercise we will do in November. All of you will get a feedback form in the next day or so. So if there's something that you didn't get out here that you would want included in that, we would ask that you include that in your feedback form so that we can feed that into the tabletop exercise as well. Right now, we're handing our panelists a gift from INSA so a memento of their time here. It's the coveted crystal INSA coaster. Okay, so again, thank our panelists very much. Okay, I want to connect this with one other thing that INSA does during the year. It's one of our really feel-good events. It's something called the INSA Achievement Awards, where we try and recognize relatively young folks in the intelligence and national security communities. We recognize a uniformed military at the 03, E6 level or below, a contractor, a government employee at the 13 level or below, an academic, a first responder, and a mentor. And I specifically want to point out the first responder sort of award. It's named the John W. Warner Homeland Security Award because Senator Warner from Virginia was very involved in setting up the Department of Homeland Security and providing oversight to it in its infancy. And he remains very focused on the topic. We try and recognize somebody at the federal, state, local, or tribal level that is involved in protecting the homeland, and I'm trying to connect it here as protecting our infrastructure. So if any of you have thoughts of someone who is involved in that, someone junior who's done a really, really outstanding job, we would welcome your nomination of that individual for this award. We do an event at the Institute of Peace in February where we recognize these folks. For many of them, it's the first time they receive this sort of recognition. The folks that we have recognized this way, in many cases, it's been transformational to their career to be recognized like this, but it's also an inspiration to others to seek careers in this profession, so we would welcome your input on that. Okay, and so finally, thanks to MITRE for the facility. Thanks, Mark. This isn't the first time, and it probably won't be the last, but thanks very much for hosting us. And in advance, Sam, thank you, and ICF, for hosting the tabletop exercise that we will have in November, and we will look forward to your feedback. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, Vencor, Raytheon, ICF International, and Spadaro. The one final thing I would mention is the two young folks that you saw up here handing out the awards, and the young man that you saw circulating around with the microphone are our amazing INSA interns, okay? They're all grad students at local universities. They're looking for jobs, okay? They're really good, so get to know them, okay? Thanks very much.